Well, hello and welcome to this week's episode of Coroner Talk. So as you can tell, the last couple of weeks I haven't done the intro, with the musical intro with the sirens. I like it, but it's kind of old, so I don't know if I'll do it. Sometimes we will, sometimes we won't, so you just never know. But, you know when that comes on, it is the Coroner Talk podcast. But you know it's a Coroner Talk podcast anyway because you can hear my lovely voice. So today's episode, we're bringing back Jeff Gentry, blood pattern expert. He discusses blood patterns in suicide cases, which, what do we look at in suicide cases when it comes to blood patterns? The number one way in America that people kill themselves is with a firearm. And often with a firearm, you're going to have some type of blood pattern. So today he talks at length about blood pattern and especially blood pattern in suicide. So without any further delay, let's jump into the conversation with Jeff Gentry.
Adjust your earbuds, turn up those speakers, and hang on. It's now time for this week's featured conversation.
Welcome, everybody. My name is Jeffrey Gentry. I am a certified bloodstain pattern analyst, certified crime scene analyst, and a death investigator, and then also an instructor for the Death Investigation Academy. Today, I'm going to be talking about a newsletter article that I published a couple months ago for the Death Investigation Academy monthly newsletter. And this is about bloodstain pattern analysis. Again, this is one of the topics that I'm most experienced in discussing because I have been a death investigator for over 15 years. I've seen thousands of death investigation scenes, and a lot of those, of course, involve blood and bleeding. So naturally, I kind of gravitated towards the blood aspect of it. I didn't start out initially focused on the blood when I was going out to death investigation scenes, and that was definitely a mistake. I always teach all of my students that the blood can tell you so much at a death scene. So if you have not had the experience of taking a blood pattern class, you're definitely missing out, especially as a death investigator, because a lot of your scenes are going all blood and bleeding. So you definitely want to, if you haven't taken a course about bloodstain pattern analysis, you want to definitely try to do that. There's a couple that I have online at the Death Investigation Academy. And then I also teach in-person bloodstain pattern analysis courses. They can be anywhere from 2 days to a week long. Some of the intro courses are going to teach you about all the different bloodstain patterns, how they're created. And then in some of the classes, I'll even show you how to make these bloodstains. That way, when you're out at a crime scene, not only are you going to recognize the patterns and recognize the bloodstains, but you're also going to be able to say, this is how those are created. And I know that because I created those myself. So if you are looking for in-person training classes, reach out to Darren at the Death Investigation Academy. Let him know what you're interested in, and then hopefully we can schedule something in your area. We can even do a combo bloodstain pattern analysis and death investigation course. So I'm going to talk about bloodstain pattern analysis in suicide by gunshot death investigations. A lot of these terms and what I'm going to explain apply to a lot of other death investigations as well, but we're going to be more focused today on suicide by gunshot death investigations. And as you know, suicide by gunshot is the most common method of suicide, and that is because it's pretty effective, right? So people have access to firearms, and that's what they're going to gravitate to when they die by suicide. If you have not investigated a lot of suicides, suicide by gunshot is the most common in the United States, followed by hanging, and then overdose, and then other methods like jumping. Jumping is, of course, more common in other countries, and it's because it's either cultural reasons or people have easy access to tall buildings where they don't have access to firearms. But in the United States, we have access to firearms. And depending on where you live, the firearm type is going to vary. I'm from California, so I see a lot of suicides with handguns, revolvers. If you go out to areas like the Midwest, you're going to see larger caliber firearms like rifles, shotguns. We do see some rifle and shotgun suicides here in California, but it's not as common. So usually it's what people have access to. That's what they're going to use when they decide to die by suicide. And so it's important to be familiar with these mechanisms and the choices that people make when they choose to die by suicide. But then, of course, you have to be able to investigate those deaths. Suicide deaths are good when it comes to bloodstain pattern analysis because for the most part, you have a pretty general idea of what happened going into it. It's not like a homicide where you get out to a scene, there's a body there, no gun, not really sure exactly how things played out. But when you go out to most suicide by gunshot cases, you're going to go out to the scene, you're going to find the victim, you're going to have a pretty good idea of what transpired going into it. There might be some things that are unexplained, but it's very good for training and especially good for training for bloodstain pattern analysis. And I'll explain why that is. So just in general, bloodstain pattern analysis is the examination of the size, the shape, the location, and the distribution of bloodstains. And using that information, you can start to explain how bloodstains and patterns are created. So for example, the size of bloodstains can vary a lot. They can be little tiny bloodstains, like less than a millimeter. And in bloodstain pattern analysis, you usually use the metrics for the really small bloodstains, and then you use like feet and inches for bigger bloodstain patterns. So we kind of combine both metric and United States method of measurements when you're doing bloodstain pattern analysis. But bloodstains in general, when you're talking about really small stains, you're talking about little tiny stains that are less than a millimeter up to a centimeter and sometimes even larger. The shape, bloodstains can be circular, they can be irregular, they can be elongated or elliptical shape with those little tails, and those tails are going to point in the direction that the bloodstain was deposited on the surface. And again, in the classes, we explain all of that. We show how bloodstains hit a surface, how the tail is created, and then how you can predict the direction of travel. Location, obviously bloodstains on a horizontal surface like a floor, they got there by some mechanism, and usually that's gravity, they fall to the ground. But if you're seeing bloodstains up on a ceiling or a wall, you have to consider that they didn't just get there on their own. Blood is very lazy. It's going to go wherever gravity takes it. So if it can just fall to the ground, that's what it wants to do. But if force is applied to it, then it might be able to travel up onto a wall, up onto a ceiling, and even higher. So you have to always look up with your blood scenes and consider how were those blood stains deposited on those surfaces. And you always have to be considering forces. Forces are going to be a big part of it. I have a background in biochemistry and molecular biology, and so I took a lot of math, physics, science. I'm definitely a science nerd. But that helps me when I am explaining bloodstains and how they got onto a surface. So you're applying the laws of physics, gravity, mathematics, and that really helps to explain bloodstains and patterns. But you don't need to have all of that to be able to recognize bloodstains and patterns out at a scene. And that's what I teach people in my class. The appearance of bloodstains. Are they whole blood? Are they dried up blood? Are they still wet? Are they dried and cracking? All of that's really important when you're looking at bloodstains because that's going to help you to predict how long they've been on that surface. Is it whole blood or not? Has that blood been cleaned up? When you look at blood, like, for example, that's been cleaned up with bleach, bloodstains will normally be a darker, like a reddish brown type color. But if you apply bleach to it, they get really dark, almost dark enough to appear like dirt in some cases. So sometimes it can be really hard to identify bloodstains at a scene when they've been cleaned up. So that's just in general what bloodstain pattern analysis is and what it can do for you. But the most important thing to understand about bloodstain pattern analysis, or BPA is the abbreviation. It's going to just help you to identify bloodstains at a scene and then explain how they were created. So the mechanism of creation is very important. That's what people want to know. How did that blood get there? How was it created? So the other things that it can do for you in some cases, and if you haven't seen this article that I'm referring to, it's in the Death Investigation Academy newsletter. It was published a couple of months ago. So that's what I'm looking at now as I go through and talk about these things. If you want a copy of it, you can email me at jeffreygentry.bpa@gmail.com, and I can send you a copy of it. And then I can also get you set up with how to get that newsletter monthly from the Death Investigation Training Academy. So things that BPA can also explain are mechanism of injury. How did the blood patterns get deposited on a surface? Like, was this a gunshot wound? Was it a stab wound? Was it a beating? Those are all going to be really important. And blood pattern analysis, depending on the pattern types, they can help you identify mechanisms of injury. Sequence of events. What events transpired first? What transpired later? So, for example, blood on a surface gets deposited, things get deposited on top of the blood, and then more blood gets deposited on the surface. Those are the type of little things that can be identified through bloodstain pattern analysis that usually you're not going to recognize at a scene if you're just going in and processing a scene. It's those little details that matter. And blood patterns can really help with sequence of events and event reconstruction. Weapon type, again, kind of like mechanism of injury. What type of weapon caused these injuries? Obviously, you're going to see different blood patterns with a 22 caliber handgun than you would with a big shotgun or from like an AR style rifle. So weapon type is very important when you're talking about homicide investigations, especially, and blood pattern can help you with that. Victim position, actually victim and or suspect position. Those can both be identified with blood pattern analysis because a lot of times in, say, for example, a stabbing scene or an assault with a sharp weapon, a lot of times the suspect gets injured themselves and also deposits blood at a scene. So victim position, obviously, that's kind of a no-brainer, right? Where you see the blood patterns is where that victim was. And depending on the pattern types, you can start to tell, was this victim assaulted low to the ground? Were they standing up? Were they shot standing up, ran across the room, and then fell to the ground? Were they dragged across a room? And all of that also comes into play when you're talking about suicide investigations, right? I've had cases where people have sustained multiple self-inflicted gunshot wounds and left quite interesting blood patterns at a scene. So one in particular that I saw was kind of way out in the county of where I live. This man was obviously depressed. He shot himself one time in the head. It went along the skull of his head and then exited. So it caused quite a bit of damage, enough to where you could tell that he started bleeding. It didn't look like at that point he'd been knocked to the ground. So he was walking for quite a while. I would imagine quite disoriented because you're going to start bleeding right away. That's going to be very painful. So he fully intended to die when he shot himself, but he didn't. And so he's walking, standing upright, and this was a dirt surface. So you don't usually, it's really difficult to recognize unique blood patterns out on dirt surfaces or grass surfaces. Usually like concrete or tile or like laminate floor, you can identify drip stains really well or bloodstain patterns really well. But this was dirt. But you could definitely see that there was an obvious trail from one location to another. And then it appeared that he, again, while standing, shot himself a second time. And that was when he sustained the fatal wound that was under his chin. And that was what caused his death. But you could tell that he fell to the ground at that point. There's no more drip stains after that. So initially it came out as rather suspicious, right? I mean, there's a gun on the ground. There's a blood trail from one location to another. So it's going to appear very suspicious at first, especially if the person has multiple gunshot wounds. But that's where your death investigation is then going to come into play in identifying the type of wounds, explaining to the officers, if they haven't seen this before, that it can happen. Although it's uncommon, people can shoot themselves multiple times, self-inflicted gunshot wounds, and eventually die by suicide. Just a quick like a detour here. I do talk about suicide a lot in my death investigation classes, also talk about it in bloodstain pattern analysis. It is a horrible thing. It's very sad for the victims and their families. I come from a family where my father had mental health issues. He actually, when I was younger, had planned out his own suicide. He wrote out a suicide letter and then purchased a rifle, actually. And then my mother found him, and then he ended up spending some time in a mental health institution. So I understand what it's like. I don't talk about these things to poke fun at it in any way. It is educational, but I do know it's difficult for the families and the victims. So, but it is a good learning opportunity. And myself, I'm all about education, so I want to use every opportunity I can to educate others, especially death investigators, because they come across a lot of really unique things that are sometimes very hard to understand if you haven't seen them before. Also, things that can be explained. BPA is victim and suspect interactions. So how did these two people interact during this event? This isn't going to so much be a factor in suicide by gunshot investigations, at least not normally. I'll explain to you a couple scenarios how it could be. But how are these two people interacting? Was this person on the ground and being assaulted or stabbed? Did the suspect touch the victim after they started bleeding? Did that suspect then transfer blood to other surfaces? One type of stain that you might see at a scene is a disturbed or altered blood stain. It's called a wipe. So sometimes the blood will start to dry already, and then something disturbs that blood and wipes through that surface. And that's pretty common. Suspects that are either cleaning up or moving a victim will touch the blood after it started to dry and essentially wipe their hand through it and create this altered or disturbed bloodstain. And that can help explain a lot. One way that this could apply to suicide by gunshot investigations is what if there is a person in close enough proximity to a person who shoots himself to have blood deposited on themselves? That would absolutely be important, because if you go out to a scene and you find blood spatter on a person who says that they were nowhere near the suicide victim, you might want to ask a few more questions, right? Because blood spatter is only going to travel so far. And if this person says that they were, half a mile down the road and heard a gunshot, yet they have small blood spatter stains on their glasses or their face, that would absolutely contradict their statement. So those are things that would be big red flags, and you want to make sure that you further investigate. Different types of blood stains that you're going to be looking at when you are investigating really any death, but more specifically suicide by gunshot deaths. I will name a couple here. The first is a forward spatter pattern. This is a bloodstain pattern that is created when a bullet or a projectile actually exits the body and creates a spatter pattern. And I'm going to explain what all of these are, but I'm first going to give you the brief definition. So the definition of that is a bloodstain pattern created when a projectile or bullet exits an exit wound. A back spatter pattern. This is a blood spatter pattern that is created when a bullet or projectile enters a wound. An expiration pattern. This is a bloodstain pattern that is created when blood is forced out of the nose or mouth. A flow pattern. This is a bloodstain pattern that is created as blood moves or flows down a surface under the influence of gravity. We've all seen this. A saturation stain. That's just blood that's absorbed into a material. A drip stain. That's blood that's created by gravity. So when blood accumulates on a surface, it's going to drip off, and then it's going to fall to a surface. Those are drip stains. And a void. A void is actually an absence of blood in a continuous pattern, and I'll explain how those can be useful and how they're created. So let's first start with a forward spatter pattern. To understand a forward spatter pattern and a back spatter pattern, you have to understand bullets and firearms. If you haven't shot firearms before, I definitely recommend it. It's good to get a feel for not only how to handle them, because you're probably going to be handling them at your death investigation scenes, but also just to understand the amount of force that's created with different firearm types, different ammunition types. But just in general, we'll talk about like small caliber like 22s or larger calibers like 45s. And then, of course, you get into your rifles and shotguns, which are much more powerful. When a firearm is fired, a projectile exits the gun or the firearm, and then it hits a target. And if it's a suicide by gunshot, it's usually like a chest or a head or a mouth, or it could be under a chin. So a forward spatter pattern is created as the projectile travels through the body and exits through an exit wound. So to have a forward spatter pattern, you have to have an entry and an exit wound. So think about how fast bullets are traveling, and think about the force that's created as they exit the body. They don't just create a perfect hole. They're actually tearing through the body. So there's expansion of the wound, and then the bullet travels, and as it travels, it's taking blood with it. All that pressure, all that blood, it's taking blood and pressure with it. And as it rips through the skin, blood travels with it. But the force of the projectile breaks up that blood source into little tiny small blood drops. And we're not talking about like big blood drops. I mean, they can be a mix of large volume, small volume blood drops, but for the most part, it's going to break it up into smaller blood drops. The more force that's applied to blood, the smaller the blood stains and blood drops are going to be. So all this blood and pressure comes out, and it creates almost like a mist of blood. If you haven't seen this before, try to look up videos online. It's pretty neat. There's some slow motion videos online that are available. If you have trouble finding them, I can point you in the right direction. But as that blood exits that exit wound, it's going to create almost like a blood mist of small little blood drops, and that blood can be deposited on nearby surfaces. It's not going to travel a real great distance. It can be several feet. Some of the large volume stains can travel further. There's research that's been done on this to see how far these blood stains are going to travel, but for the most part, it's going to be several feet. It's going to be within fairly close proximity to the victim. So if the person has their head near a wall or a couch or some other surface, those little blood stains can be deposited on that. And it's going to be just like a random, almost like a conical shaped distribution of small blood stains. And then of course that projectile will most likely hit that surface too. So you're going to get like a strike mark or a bullet hole in the wall or the surface where that pattern is also deposited. I've seen this a lot in cases. One in particular that really stands out to me, it was a man who was seated in a vehicle. He used a 9mm handgun, and he shot himself in the mouth. That bullet exited the top of his head. When it exited, the roof of the car was only a couple of feet away, so it deposited a misting type pattern on the roof of the car. But there was also, of course, a bullet hole within the middle of that pattern from where the bullet went through the top of the car, but there was a misting pattern. So had, like, say, for example, EMS came out to that scene and moved this man out of the vehicle, moved the gun around, I could say with very good certainty that not only was he seated in the car, but I could start to reconstruct his position in the car based on the bullet hole and also based on the bloodstain pattern that was there. So if somebody argued, well, no, he was seated in a different position in the vehicle, that's incorrect because there's no other way that misting type pattern would have been deposited on that ceiling, as well as the bullet hole from that projectile that exited his head. So that's how forward spatter patterns can be utilized. Another one that I had that was an absence of blood. It was a man that, same type of thing, he shot himself. Actually, this man shot himself under the chin with a larger caliber firearm. That bullet exited the top of his head, but he had a blanket or a material over his body when he shot himself. And I don't know what the reason for this was. I would imagine to kind of muffle the sound because his family was nearby. But the bullet lodged in the blanket, so never hit the ceiling. And then when I was looking around the scene, I see obviously an exit wound at the top of the head. I see bloodstains under his body, but we never found a exit, like a bullet hole in the nearby surfaces, nor did we see a forward spatter pattern. So I knew to start looking around, and I started looking around through that material, and that's when we found the projectile that was embedded in it. So you can use forward spatter patterns to identify someone's position, but then you can also use them to kind of exclude events or look for other information at a scene. They're very helpful. Back spatter patterns. So back spatter patterns are created in essentially the same way as forward spatter, but the back spatter patterns, the blood is going to travel opposite the direction of the projectile's path. So again, when a bullet enters a body this time, it's going to tear through the skin. It's going to be applying force to the skull, the skin, and the blood in the tissues, the blood in the brain. It's going to create a cavity. A lot of times you're going to get more backspatter when the bullet does not exit the head because the blood doesn't really have anywhere to go, so all that pressure comes right back out the entrance hole. But you can also get backspatter patterns when the bullet goes all the way through and creates a forward spatter pattern as well. So you might have a forward spatter pattern as the bullet is exiting the head or the body, and then you might have a back spatter pattern in the direction opposite the bullet's travel. Back spatter patterns, just like forward spatter, can be really helpful in helping to explain body position or victim position. Most usually, you're going to be looking at the position of the hand. Did this person shoot themselves? That's what everybody wants to know in a gunshot wound case. And so backspatter patterns can help with that. Sometimes when there's hard contact, you don't get as much backspatter on the victim's hands or arms or nearby surfaces because The gun actually, with a hard contact wound, is going to prevent a lot of that back spatter from being deposited on nearby surfaces. But you might want to look inside the firearm, look at the end of the firearm, look inside the barrel, because you might get some back spatter stains in there. And again, just like forward spatter, the force is going to break up the blood source into all these little small volume blood drops, and it's going to create like a misting effect. So there's going to be small mist-like blood stains that can be deposited on nearby surfaces. This can also be really important in homicide cases. Where was that shooter at when they fired the firearm that killed their victim? Were they close enough to the body to have small mist-like backspatter stains deposited on their body, their arm, on their clothing? Never forget to analyze people's clothing, because these small little backspatter stains, they are not obvious. They're going to be hard to find in some cases, but it can really help you to reconstruct events and to identify where people are at within a scene. A lot of times on suicide gunshot cases, you're always going to look at the hand and try to figure out were they right-handed or left-handed, figure out where is the entrance wound and where is the exit wound. Obviously, if there's no exit wound, the only blood stains that can be created by this mechanism are backspatter, because there's no exit wound for forward spatter to be created. So usually in these cases, I'm always looking at the victim's arms, hands, and you want to look in the places like the back of the hand, the webbing of the hand. Obviously, if they were holding a firearm, their hand would be void of blood stains in the area where they were holding the firearm. So that's really, really important to look at as well. But always look at people's hands. They're not always going to be there, so you're not always going to get backspatter in every single suicide by gunshot case. So you can't say, well, there's no backspatter, so this is definitely not suicide. It doesn't work that way. Because of the way forces work and blood works and the different firearm types, you're not always going to get it in every case. But if you do get it, it is more investigative information that's going to help explain that this was a suicide by gunshot. I just went to a case the other day where a man, he was in a hotel, he was by himself, allegedly, and he didn't have any real mental health history. And he shot himself with I believe it was a 45 caliber firearm, a semi-automatic. And looking at the blood stains, everything would suggest that he was standing upright. Then he fell to the ground. There were a few more blood stains created. But I found one single backspatter stain on the web of his hand that would be consistent with him having held that firearm up and close to the wound when it was created. So just that one little blood stain was all I found, one little backspatter stain, but it was a nice little elliptical stain, and the tail was pointing in the direction opposite the wound. So I could tell that blood stain would have had to have been deposited coming out of the wound and onto his hand while it's in a position as he's holding the gun up to his head. So that was very helpful in that case, and I always photograph it, measure it. That way, if there's ever any questions later, you can help use the bloodstains or patterns to explain events. You're not always going to have a lot of people questioning the blood at the scene, but later when families start saying that this is not a suicide, or that this, when people start wanting to make an arrest and convict somebody of a homicide, that's when people are going to start questioning the bloodstains and patterns, especially when the suspect comes with a statement. Investigators are going to want to know, is this statement consistent with what could have happened, or is it contradicted by the blood? That's when those bloodstains and patterns are going to be really important, so you want to make sure that you document them in every single case. The next pattern that we're going to talk about is an expiration pattern. Expiration bloodstains are when blood is forced out of the nose, mouth, or airway. And the force is going to be the airway. So your lungs, say for example, if you cough or breathe, that's going to break the blood up. So in the last cases with back spatter and forward spatter, we were talking about how the projectile is the force. All of that's going to break that blood source up. But in this case, it's going to be the force of the airway. Your lungs, your respiratory system, that's going to break that blood source up, and it's going to create small volume blood drops that can be deposited on nearby surfaces. It's very common in cases of shootings, like say, for example, somebody gets shot in the neck or the nose or the face or the mouth. They're not going to die immediately in most cases. They're going to still be breathing for a few minutes. They're going to be essentially swallowing their blood. They're going to get blood in their nose and mouth. They're going to start coughing and choking. And as they start to cough and choke, their going to be fighting to stay alive, and then they cough, and that's going to cause that blood to be broken up and then deposited on nearby surfaces. A lot of times you see this in cases where somebody has fallen to the ground and they're laying on their back, and you see little blood stains around their head, and those are blood that's being coughed up, and it follows a little like parabolic path. So it's almost like raining down around their head as they're coughing up these blood stains. Usually you don't see a lot of expiration patterns when people are upright, because it's kind of serious if you're starting to cough up blood. But what about cases of like lung cancer? I had a case one time, a lady that was at home, she was alone, and you could see in her home where she started coughing up blood in the bathroom. She coughed up a little bit in the sink. There was a few drip stains on the floor. And then eventually she was struggling to get help. She made it out to her front door, and she coughed up blood into a trash can. So there was a large volume of blood and lung tissue in this trash can. And then there's a expiration pattern on the wall, and then there's expiration patterns on the ground. And somebody found her like this. So neighbors just came by and found this poor lady. And obviously that's going to be traumatizing. So somebody's going to call in to the police and EMS. And when police get there, they're just going to see blood everywhere. And they're going to think that something really bad happened, not knowing this person's medical history and events that transpired. But then looking at the scene circumstances, this person's medical history, and then, of course, the blood patterns, you can start to piece it together that this person had lung cancer. This isn't a traumatic event. So this person wasn't shot in the mouth or airway. This person was coughing up blood because of a natural event. That can happen too. But in cases of gunshot, and when somebody is taking their last few breaths, you might get those expiration patterns. And remember, an expiration pattern is blood is forced out of the nose, the mouth, or the airway. If you ever have something like a bloody nose, I've seen this at my kids' school, actually. Try to sneeze when you have that bloody nose. I know, it's kind of weird, but the only way that you can learn about blood patterns is through experimentation. So if you have a non-serious injury or a nosebleed, or you get a little blood in your mouth or something, cough it up, spit it up, sneeze, and see what it does. That way, when you see those things at crime scenes, you're going to know what happened. So what happened at my kids' school was one day my daughter came running up to me after school, and she knows I do the blood pattern analysis, and she's actually really into it too. She's 12 now, and she's told me that there was blood all over a wall. So we actually went out there and tested it. We looked at the blood stains, and they followed a distribution of blood stains that would be consistent with almost like an impact event. But obviously it's an elementary school, so it's not an impact event. These kids weren't fighting. So what we could figure out was probably that some kid had a nosebleed and sneezed or coughed and created this expiration pattern on a wall. And it was about the same height as an elementary school kid. So expiration patterns, again, can be forced out of the nose, mouth, or airway. And look around. You'll find blood all over the place if you're looking. Flow patterns. Flows are pretty easy. We've seen this a lot. Flows usually occur when there's a volume of blood. So next time you cut your finger or your hand, or you get any kind of little injury, hang your hand down and see where the blood flows. The blood is going to follow gravity. And the same thing is going to happen at a crime scene. So when somebody gets injured, blood's going to flow down their face, their arms. If their arm is upright, it's going to flow down under the force of gravity. And then if that body is moved into a different position, the blood's going to dry pretty quick on a warm body. I actually had, this is one of the times I got kicked off of TikTok. So I have a TikTok account, YouTube, Facebook, Instagram. I'm going to be doing a lot more with YouTube in the near future, analyzing blood in movies. But the one time I got kicked off of TikTok was I cut myself shaving. I don't have any hair, so I shaved my head. And I cut myself pretty good. And so blood just started flowing. So I started photographing it. Instead of doing anything, I just photographed it. And it dried almost immediately on my skin, because your body is 100 degrees almost. And so that blood's going to dry pretty quick. Even though it was a fairly serious wound, and it was a head injury, so it was bleeding pretty good, it dried pretty fast. So you have to have a pretty good injury to have enough blood to accumulate and then start creating drip stains on the ground. But this, I was looking at the flow patterns. And so the blood was flowing down under the influence of gravity from the injury on my head. It flowed down my neck. And then I actually created some other patterns, just wiping my hand through the blood just to see how it looked after it started to dry. If you're really curious about that, I could send you photographs of it, no problem. But of course, they kicked me off TikTok for a while. But I got my account back because all of my information on TikTok is educational. They just don't like the blood a lot. But flow patterns are extremely useful to help identify position of a body, position of a victim when they were bleeding. And then, of course, after that blood has dried, if that person's been moved to a different position, or sometimes the blood flows will shift as that person is moving around. So you have to consider that as well. They might have been upright, but then they fall to the ground before that blood dries. And then so it's going to create flows down the body as they were upright. And then it's going to create additional flows after they're in, say, a horizontal position on the ground. So blood flows are also very important at scenes. Saturation stains, those are pretty straightforward, right? I mean, blood's going to saturate into any absorbent material. If you have blood that's on a tile surface or on a laminate surface, maybe in a bathtub, that blood's not going to be able to absorb up into that material. But if you have blood on clothing, if you have blood on a wood surface, on a couch, on beds, it's going to just soak into that surface. So it's really hard to identify the volume of blood in a saturation stain, but it can help you to identify that there was a large enough volume there on that surface to saturate up into that material. So if you have a bed that has a really large blood outline, you have to consider that if that bloody saturation stain is rather large, you're probably looking at a rather large amount of blood that created that saturation stain. You can possibly do some experimentation to help identify how much blood we're talking about, using the same material, using real blood, but you got to be really conservative when you're analyzing blood stains on materials. You can identify blood spatter stains. You can identify direction that blood was deposited onto fabric surfaces. But saturation stains, that's just absorbed up into a material, and it can help you to identify where that person was for a period of time when they were on that surface. Drip stains, we kind of touched on this a little bit. Drip stains are blood stains that's formed when an object is bleeding. Just one example is, say I get a wound to my arm, and that blood is accumulating on my fingertips. Gravity is going to create circular blood drops. So blood that falls off of a surface due to its internal properties like surface tension, viscosity, and then also gravity, it's going to want to form a circle. So it's going to fall off of that finger, create a little circle, and it's going to fall down to a surface, and it's going to create, if it hits at 90 degrees, a circular blood stain on the ground. If it hits at an angle less than 90 degrees, it's going to create an elliptical shaped stain. And then that little tail of the blood stain is going to help tell you the direction that it hit a surface. The surface itself is really important. So if blood drip stain is created on a nice smooth surface, you're going to get a really nice clean circle. But if you go out to like concrete and create blood drops, you're going to get more of those jagged or scalloped edges along the outside. We talked about dirt surfaces initially. Go do some blood drops on tile versus laminate versus wood, and then go out and try doing some blood drops in the dirt. You're not going to get a circular blood stain at all. That blood's just going to soak into that dirt, and you're going to get just a little stain there. The surface itself is going to be really important when you're looking at the features of the blood stain, the outline of the blood stain, or the edge characteristics. But drip stains are really common at a lot of crime scenes. A lot of crime scenes, any bloody scene at all, because usually when somebody starts bleeding, their wounds are typically not immediately fatal. So if that person is stabbed, shot, if they are beaten, they're not just going to stay still. They're going to want to try to run around. They're going to evade their attacker. And even in like the case of the suicide that I mentioned initially, that man was upright. And so blood is accumulating on those surfaces. It's going to start falling to the ground almost immediately, and it's going to create drip stains. So drip stains are really important. If you see a lot of them in one area, like the blood is falling into blood that's already on a surface, you're going to get a really unique pattern. It's called blood into blood. That's also a type of drip stain. And then as they start moving around, you're going to see little circular drip stains moving from one location to another. That's called a drip trail. But drip stains are probably the most common thing that you're going to see at any crime scene. If you get like an injury to a neck or a head or a body part, sometimes you'll see drip stains that extend multiple blocks before that person loses enough blood to die. So drip stains are very important. Now, one of the things that I added to my article, I'm looking at it now, is a picture of a victim that was on the ground. There's circular drip stains on the ground around their body, but then they have drip stains that fell on their legs while they were in an upright or vertical position. So in this case, you could tell that the victim was upright when they started bleeding because the blood hit their leg and is creating a drip stain going down with the force of gravity. And then they fall to the ground. So there's circular drip stains on the ground, but then there's elongated or elliptical shaped stains on their legs. And there's even drip stains on the top of their feet. That's really important too. So always look at the tops of people's feet and the bottom of their feet to see if they were maybe walking in the blood. But drip stains are extremely important in any crime scene, very important in suicide by gunshot investigations because it can tell you, was the person upright at any point? Were they moving around? Were they walking around after they were injured? Were they in one location for a while and they were dripping blood into existing blood that's already on the surface? Then you also want to look at, was there any disturbance of these blood stains? Were they manipulated in some way? Like, for example, was the person still alive after, or was there somebody else in the room that disturbed these blood stains after they were deposited on a surface? The last type of bloodstain, or the bloodstain pattern type that we're going to discuss, is voids. Voids, a lot of times, you'll get those, like, say, for example, somebody is seated on a couch or in a chair, and they're bleeding all around, like on the armrest. Maybe they're bleeding on the ground around the body, but there's no blood on the back of the chair. Obviously, their back is blocking the blood from being deposited on that surface. And they're moved from that surface, and then you get a nice void on that chair. That's usually the most common way that you're going to see a blood void. Or say, for example, you have I've seen this before where there's like cell phones on the ground, and somebody gets injured. They drop their cell phone. There's no blood under the cell phone, but then you have blood drip stains that are deposited on the top of the cell phone, all around the cell phone, and then somebody comes back, picks up the cell phone, and removes it from that scene. You're going to have the perfect blood void there because it's a continuous pattern. Then you're going to have a void where that cell phone was at that prevented that blood from being deposited on a surface. What about a person that's in a room and witnesses a shooting incident? So you might have that forward spatter pattern on a wall, but there might be a void in an area where another suspect was standing in close enough proximity to block that forward spatter pattern from being deposited on a wall. But that's when you're going to want to look at that person's clothing or start collecting clothing and thinking about, well, you've got blood spatter all over you. There's a void on the wall here where somebody was obviously standing. So this puts you in that room when that shooting happened. So voids can be really important. Some of the cases that I've seen that blood voids can be really helpful in suicide investigations is hand position. This can be important in suicide investigations and homicide investigations. So say you're in a situation where you have your left arm on your body and then you're shot using your right arm. So there should be a void on your abdomen where that left arm is resting across your body. So the blood can be deposited all over the place on the top surface of that arm, but it's not going to be deposited where that arm was laying or resting. Now think about it another way. What if there is a gunshot wound victim who's maybe sleeping on a bed and they've got both of their arms down to their side or resting on their abdomen, and they're shot, and so they start either coughing up blood or there's forward spatter or back spatter being deposited all around them. But they have that void. So that's where you can say that this is the position that their arms and hands were in when they were shot and when they started bleeding. And we know that because there's no blood on the underside of that surface. So it created a void because blood's deposited all around them and on the top surfaces of their arms and body, but not under their arms and their body. So that's how voids can be really helpful. And that just kind of just gives you the basics understanding how bloodstain patterns can be useful in suicide by gunshot investigations. It can also be very informative in homicide investigations, actually any death investigation. So I always tell people that I think that death investigators are perfect for bloodstain pattern analysis because they see a lot of blood. They're out at bloody scenes all the time. And death investigators not only have access to homicide cases, suicide cases, but they're also going to have access to bleeding in all different type of deaths. So natural deaths you can bleed, overdose deaths you can bleed. A lot of the fentanyl deaths that I've seen, people tend to bleed from the nose and mouth. It's pretty common in fentanyl overdoses. And if you haven't seen those yet, try to find somebody who has access to these cases. And and look at the photographs. You almost always get bleeding from the nose and mouth. Sometimes when you overdose, your body starts to shut down and you're going to bleed in the airway. And then as you're struggling, you're going to create that bloody, frothy sputum. You might even get that expiration pattern as you're coughing, as you're dying. So bloodstain patterns can be useful in every single type of death investigation. It can only make you a better death investigator. And again, if you are interested in in-person classes for bloodstain pattern analysis or death investigation, reach out to Darren at the Death Investigation Academy. Try to get something scheduled. I love teaching in-person classes, especially to death investigators. If you don't know much about me yet, I've been teaching for the Death Investigation Academy for a while. I've got a few classes on there online. I've got several about bloodstain pattern analysis. I have one about suicide death investigation using scenarios to explain my approach. And then I also have one coming out that talks about death investigation and all of the questions you should ask during a death investigation. And it's called Death Investigation Information to Obtain During a Forensic Death Investigation. That's coming out soon. I'm also an author. I have multiple books online and on Amazon. I've got blood patterns, suicide investigation, death investigation. And then I also created a cute little cartoon book about what is a death investigator. So if you have anybody that's starting out, they're great for Christmas gifts too, explaining what you do as a death investigator. And then, of course, I also have a cute cartoon book that's available. It's called Mr. Mosquito, Bloodstain Pattern Analyst, and it's about a mosquito, supposed to be myself, that goes out and solves bloody scenes using his mosquito blood abilities. You can also follow me online. But if you ever have questions, I love helping people out, and I'm always available as a resource. You can email me at jeffreygentry.bpa@gmail.com. And definitely check out my other podcast at the Death Investigation Academy.
All right. I hope you enjoyed that. I know you did lots of great training in there, so I know you got something out of that. And I appreciate you sticking around until the end. Remember, as I spoke of last week, I think it was, if you haven't left a rating and review on iTunes, podcast, directory, whichever one you use, I'd be most honored if you would, and I can even read those on the air. So thank you for sticking around this long. Thank you for being longtime listeners. Many of you have listened for many, many years, and I hear from you occasionally, and I do appreciate that. Remember, if you have anything you want to reach out to Jeff Gentry about, you know how to do that. You can also contact us through our website, and we can certainly get a hold of him and get some questions answered as well. If you're interested in any of his training, we do have some of his courses on our Death Investigation Academy website as well. So until next week, everybody, find a way to be a blessing. Find a way to make somebody in your life smile. Find a way to help, not hurt. Be a blessing. Be safe. See you next week.
Thanks for listening to Coroner Talk, a DSPN media production. Visit our website at coronertalk.com. And be sure to like us on Facebook at facebook.com/coronertraining. 3617 1024 scene en route to morgue.